Free speech from the First Amendment. Obviously, it was first declared in the First Amendment when they said, "No law will abridge the freedom of speech." Relevant terms, some things you should know before moving on: state action requirements, restriction of congressional powers. Libel is written defamation. Slander is verbal defamation. Defamation is just something that injures someone's reputation. Absolute privilege is absolute defense to that defamation. Prior restraint, which we'll see later, is government action prohibiting speech or other expression before it can take place. But what does it mean? We see several definitions here. The first being vague, the right to express any opinions without censorship or restraint. And the next that specifies reasonable limitations. But what are reasonable limitations? Functions of the First Amendment. We see it constitutes as one of the most essential foundations of a democratic society. It's one of the most basic conditions for its progress. And without it, you're basically in an authoritarian regime. One connection we see is that of freedom of speech in the media and press. It's a strong factor of media's ability to cover, and it's a very powerful force. Press has the responsibility to criticize the authorities when mistakes are made. News should stimulate criticizing attitudes towards political course, and programs shall be defined according to the taste of the audience. These, again, are characteristics of a very democratic society. Another connection we see with freedom of speech is that of PACs and interest groups. Money means power, means influence on policy and speech. In one political cartoon, we see a super PAC, which is just a bag of money commanding the Oval Office to schedule a press conference. And then we see a politician here practically drooling at the chance to get some money from this special interest group. But what constitutes as a legitimate reason for government interference? In the Texas versus Johnson case, we see Johnson that burned an American flag outside of the 1984 Republican National Convention to protest the policies of Reagan. He was charged with violating a Texas statute that prevented the desecration of venerated object, as such action were likely to incite anger in others. A Texas court convicted Johnson. He appealed, arguing that his actions were symbolic speech protected by the First Amendment. In the verdict, we see that the majority of the court agreed with Johnson, held that it was a form of symbolic speech. And the main point of this was that the society's outrage alone is not justification for suppressing free speech. It is also significant to note that the battle between protecting the flag as a national symbol and protecting freedom of expression is an ongoing battle. In the New York Times versus Sullivan case, New York Times published an ad which criticized the police department in the city of Montgomery for its treatment of protesters. Most of it was accurate, but some of the statements were false. Police Commissioner Sullivan sued the New York Times, arguing that the ad had damaged his reputation and he had been libeled. The Alabama court ruled in favor of Sullivan, finding the newspaper ad falsely represented the police department. The New York Times took its case to the United States Supreme Court, arguing that it was protected under the First Amendment. In the New York Times versus Sullivan verdict, we see that the Supreme Court unanimously ruled in favor of the newspaper. The right to publish all statements is protected under the First Amendment. The court also said in order to prove libel, actual malice must be proved. In the Neer versus Minnesota case, Neer published a scandal sheet in Minneapolis in which he attacked local officials, charging they were implicated with gangsters. Minnesota officials obtained an injunction to prevent Neer from publishing his newspaper under a state law that said any person regularly publishing or circulating a scandalous or defamatory newspaper or periodical was guilty of a nuisance and could be enjoined or stopped from further committing or maintaining the nuisance. In the verdict, we see that the Supreme Court held that the statute authorizing the injunction was unconstitutional as applied. This established the prior restraint doctrine. The Supreme Court also held that censorship is unconstitutional. In the U.S. versus Schenck case, we see that during World War I, Schenck mailed flyers to draftees. They suggested that the draft was a monstrous wrong motivated by the capitalist system. He urged them do not submit to intimidation, but advised only peaceful action, such as petitioning. Schenck was charged with conspiracy to violate the Espionage Act by attempting to cause insubordination in the military and to obstruct recruitment. The verdict in this case is a bit different than the others we've seen thus far. They concluded that Schenck is not protected in this situation. A nice, valuable quote that I think sums up this entire case fairly well is, "The question in every case is whether the words used are used in such circumstances and are of such a nature as to create a clear and present danger that will bring about the substantive evils that Congress has a right to prevent." During wartime, for example, utterances tolerable in peacetime can be punished. Because Schenck threatened the military forces during a time that they were practically invaluable, he was punished. Though the federal government seems to rule in favor of the publisher or distributor of debatable material, it is important to value the presence of freedom of speech in America. It is also of significance to note that something all these cases share is their confrontation with government or local officials. These are what become noteworthy cases, cases that go against power. We need to be allowed to say what we want as long as our words don't cause tangible harm to people's bodies or property. Our society will stagnate and we will be prisoners in our own skulls, only permitted to say things that the authorities approve of. I always think of dystopian novels and in this case. And you wouldn't want to live in 1994, now would you?